And please welcome Eugene Volokh to the Unity Now podcast. Hi, Gene. Hi, Eugene. How are you doing?
I'm
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining us. And we're here to talk about an article you wrote that's titled New York State Wants to Conscript Me to Violate the Constitution." And you write, "A law going into effect Saturday requires social media networks, including any site that allows comments, to publish a plan for responding to alleged hate speech by users." And if you could talk about what's going on with that and kind of get into the background for why you think that will violate the Constitution.
sure. So the statute that has just been enacted, or excuse me, has just gone into effect in New York, is called "Social Media Networks: Hateful Conduct Prohibited." That's the title. If you read the text, it doesn't actually prohibit hateful conduct, which is which is its term for what many people call hate speech. But it does require social media networks, that includes any site that has comments on it, to have policies for how they deal with this kind of speech, with those kinds of viewpoints. And we think it requires these sites to reply to people's complaints under those policies. So first, the law defines hateful conduct to be use of a social media network to vilify, humiliate, or incite violence against a group or class of persons on the basis of race, color, religion, ethnicity, national origin, disability, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So this will cover a lot of things, many of which are fully constitutionally protected. So, for example, sharp criticisms of some religious groups, maybe of Scientology or of conservative Christianity or of jihadist Islam or of Catholicism, might be seen as vilifying or humiliating class of persons on the basis of religion. Likewise, disagreements with transgender rights ideology, statements such as people who say they're transgender, if they were born a man, they're still a man, and there's nothing they can do to change that. Those kinds of statements might be seen as vilifying groups based on gender identity. Yet those are fully constitutionally protected statements, whether or not, of course, you agree with them. So what does the law require? It requires that a social media network, and again, that's broad enough to include any site, like, for example, the blog that I run that has comments on it where people can comment, that it shall have a clear and concise policy, readily available and accessible, which includes how such social media network will respond and address the reports, of incidents of hateful conduct on their platform. So it requires us to do two things, and to do two things because of the existence of certain viewpoints on our site potentially that the New York legislature disapproves of. It requires us to announce a policy for how we will deal with this speech. And as we read it, it says the policy explains how we will respond and address the reports of such incidents. So as we read it, it requires us to actually respond to complaints. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to have a policy for dealing with supposed hate speech or any other kind of viewpoint. If they told me I have to have a policy for dealing with anti-police speech or anti-American speech, I wouldn't want to have a policy to do that. Nor do I want to have a legal obligation to respond to people's complaints. Often when they send me a complaint, I will respond just because, they might be interested in hearing, and I may be interested in responding, but I don't want to be legally obligated. And sometimes somebody might just keep bucking me, and I'll say, look, I'm just not going to respond to you anymore. The law, as we read it, requires us to respond. Now, we filed a motion for preliminary injunction to block the law, and the government filed a response. And they say, actually, that even though the statute says that the policy must include how such social media network will respond and address the reports of incidents of hateful conduct, actually our policy could say we won't respond. that seems like a strange reading of the statute, but they're trying to minimize the obligation, I think, recognizing that these kinds of obligations raise serious First Amendment problems, as problems of compelled speech, for example. So if they're right, then yeah, despite the will respond language, maybe it isn't really binding on us to respond, although it's hard to see why they'd be right in that interpretation. They also claim that this requirement of having a policy is content neutral, they say, because we could have a policy that says our policy is not to take things down, or our policy is to take things down only when we think they merit taking down. But it's clear from the text of the law that the purpose of the law is to deal with particular kinds of viewpoints. It's not content neutral. It specifically indicates the content and, in fact, the viewpoint that it's trying to target. What's more, if we have a policy that says only, here's how we will respond to claims of hateful conduct, that would satisfy the law. On the other hand, if a policy says only, here's how we'll respond to claims of threats or libel, then that won't satisfy the law because that won't cover all of hateful conduct. So it's true we have a lot of latitude in what policy to implement, but we still have to create and announce a policy. We have to speak, and the quality of that policy is going to be judged about whether it covers complaints of certain kinds of viewpoints. So it seems to us like a clear violation of the First Amendment rule that people can't be restricted from speaking or compelled to speak based on viewpoint. Finally, the state also says, well, it's just a consumer protection measure, that we're just required to announce the policy so consumers know what kind of site they're dealing with. But it's hard to see how that could be reconciled with a specific viewpoint targeting of the law, right? You can imagine a law that says any platform must have policies for dealing with, You can imagine a law that says that a platform must explain to users how they deal with any conduct, with any kind of speech, just so that people know what they're getting into. So if they have a policy banning anti-government speech or anti-police speech or whatever else, they have to explain that. If they have a policy having to do with speech that offends based on race or religion or sexual orientation, well, they have to explain that. If they have a policy that says don't post information about where my private airplane is, to look at something drawn from the news, they have to mention that. That might be seen as a consumer protection measure because it explains to consumers what they can and can't post.
Right.
But a law that's targeted to a very particular kind of viewpoint isn't a means of just protecting consumers. It's a means of trying to pressure platforms into restricting that kind of viewpoint, and therefore is violation of the First Amendment. The hearing, by the way, is going to be on Monday the 19th. So perhaps very soon we're going to hear at least what is a preliminary matter, because we're asking for a preliminary injunction, what the judge thinks of our arguments.
Wow. So yeah, we're recording this for everyone on Friday, the December 16th. So you're saying on this coming Monday, the 19th, is the hearing?
Yes.
Wow. In this law, I'm curious what, all the way to the end, the action that would be taken if you were to violate this law, if it were to be enacted, what would happen to you if you didn't publish such a policy and go by the law?
$1,000 per day in fines if the New York Attorney General brought an enforcement action.
Okay. Yeah, in your Wall Street Journal article, you write that, the law blog that you run fits the bill, so the law will mandate that you post publicly your policy for responding to comments that vilify, humiliate, or incite violence against a group based on race, color, religion, ethnicity, national origin, disability, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. It also requires that I give readers a way to complain about my blog's content and obligates me to respond directly. And then you say by obligating you to do the state's bidding with regard to viewpoints that New York condemns, the law violates the First Amendment. Do you believe that any content moderation can actually exist without eventually eroding over and above the constitutional and free speech?
Well, it all depends. Content moderation by whom? So private entities like me or like Twitter or like Facebook are not bound by the First Amendment. The first word of the First Amendment is Congress. Congress shall make the law. 14th Amendment starts with no state shall. That's applied First Amendment principles to state and local governments. So when platforms moderate content, and when my blog moderates content, we occasionally do block usually things that contain personal insults that we think will derail the conversation. That's not a First Amendment violation. Now, one can argue that it's bad for free speech. One could argue that, for example, Twitter and Facebook and other such tremendously important platforms shouldn't, for example, block users from posting things based on their viewpoints. There are laws in Texas and Florida. The Florida law has been blocked by a court. Texas law has been sort of preliminarily upheld by a court. There are such laws that impose those kinds of obligations. But the First Amendment itself does not. The First Amendment does, however, limit the government's power to force people to moderate speech or to pressure them into moderating speech. By the way, it doesn't completely eliminate that. If the government wanted to say platforms must delete material that has been found to be threatening, true threats of violence, let's say, or has been found to be libelous, that might well be constitutional. Right now, platforms are, by federal law, not required to delete such material. But in principle, there are exceptions to First Amendment protection, such as for true threats of violence, for libel, for child pornography. Platforms generally are required to remove material once they learn it's child pornography. So there are some such narrow exceptions to the First Amendment. There is no exception, though, for supposed hate speech, because the court says that all viewpoints are equally protected by the First Amendment, including viewpoints that many people might sharply disapprove of, including viewpoints the justices might sharply disapprove. Because under the First Amendment, the government can't be trusted to decide which viewpoints should be banned and which viewpoints should be allowed. It's neither up to the Obama administration, nor the Trump administration, nor some perhaps future Kamala Harris or Ron DeSantis administration to decide these viewpoints are hateful or evil, they need to be banned. None of them have the rights, and neither do state and local governments. They don't have the right to restrict people's ability to express their viewpoints, and to pick and choose which viewpoints should be restricted.
Yeah, and you mentioned posting things about where your plane is. That's about Elon Musk and Twitter right now, and he's blocked an account with that automatically shows where his plane is and people that post it as well. And that's kind of what you're saying there. It depends on who would be moderating that, because everyone was happy when people that were in the middle or on the right were really happy when Elon bought Twitter and said, yeah, we're going to open back, accounts that were blocked and that were moderated. And the Twitter files came out this last 2 weeks. But now is he going, back to moderation as well and blocking accounts potentially? And it's the same problem, that used to be when it was a public company, right? And so, yeah, it really matters who can actually do that. And like you said, really nobody can make that decision.
Well, the owner of the private company can make that decision, at
Well,
least under the
sure.
First Amendment. But the government can't force that decision, at least by default, absent some statute that restricts platform moderation decisions. It's private property and up to each proprietor's decision, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg and the board of directors of Facebook, let's say, or Elon Musk, or me, because I own my blog. So that's the default. But the government can't force me to block certain viewpoints or stop me from blocking particular viewpoints. Maybe the government can impose a viewpoint neutral requirement of viewpoint neutrality, saying, look, Elon Musk or whoever owns Twitter or whoever owns Facebook is not allowed to block things based on viewpoint. Just like the phone company isn't allowed to cancel people's phone lines because it disapproves of the viewpoint expressed on them. That kind of statute might or might not be constitutional. Again, there is a hot debate about this. But my view, and pretty confident the courts will see it our way, is that whatever the legislature might do with regard to moderation, it has to do it in a viewpoint neutral way. It can't target particular viewpoints for moderation, even just for requiring platforms to have some policy, whatever the platforms might decide related to those viewpoints.
Okay, and that makes sense. Yeah, that's correct. And for background on this, really quick, the motivation behind this is from May 14th. 10 black people were murdered by a white white guy that was, didn't really like black people. And on October 18th, New York Attorney General released a report on the role of online platforms in the mass shooting. And, it talked about online platforms like 4chan, 8con, Discord, Reddit, Twitch, and YouTube that helped him learn about this, grow his hate, and plan his attack and take it out. So the motivation seems like it's from a good place, potentially, right, to stop this kind of thing from happening again. But as you wrote in your article, it can't go behind the Constitution to do that.
Look, throughout American history, there have been attempts to ban speech, generally because of a sense that that speech is harmful, and often a correct sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Speech that, for example, urges violent revolution, whether left wing or right wing, historically had been sort of socialist and communist and anarchist violent revolution, may lead to violent revolution. And even if it's not a successful revolution, may lead to violence that a lot of people will be killed in the process of trying to stop the revolution.
Right.
Speech that sharply condemns police officers might help motivate targeted assassination of police officers. In fact, there have been some targeted attacks on police officers, probably motivated in part by anti-police speech. Speech that endorses a jihadist view of Islam can and has led to jihadist terrorist attacks. And likewise, speech that urges racism, whether against blacks or whites or anti-Semitism against my own group, Jews, that has in fact led to violent attacks on those groups. But the court has said, including in cases involving the KKK and Nazis and others, as well as far left extremists and others, that we can't allow the government to suppress even advocacy of violence unless it's intended to and likely to promote imminent lawless action. So basically right now. So if somebody is standing in front of a building and says, burn it down, could be a police station, could be a synagogue, could be an abortion clinic, could be a draft office, could be a courthouse, then that person, if he's speaking to a mob, may be intended to and likely to produce imminent illegal conduct, then that person could be punished. But just sort of talking in the abstract about, there ought to be violent revolution and the capitalists need to be shot, or the police need to be shot, or the Jews or the blacks or the whites or whoever else, or the infidels, that speech under American First Amendment law has been held to be protected. And by the way, there's a reason why the court held that, because for some decades before it, protection had ebbed and flowed. And sometimes, for example, advocacy against socialist revolution, or communist revolution, or racist conduct had been restricted by the government. And sometimes the court had earlier upheld that. Later, especially in 1969, the case that I'm citing here is from the Warren Court. In 1969, the Supreme Court unanimously adopted this very speech protective rule because it concluded that, when the government was given more power to restrict speech, it abused that power.
Okay. Do you have any kind of sense of what kind of solution could be imagined that does not cross the free speech line, that also presents real world improvement given the almost unnatural amount of information that humans have access now in the modern age?
There are pretty traditional approaches to that, right? Which is you punish crime, right? If somebody is talking about how there needs to be a revolution against the existing order, you say, well, you start a revolution, we're going to arrest you if it's outright treason or murder. We might even execute you, or at the very least, we'll lock you up for a long time. If you try to shoot up a synagogue, we're going to punish you. If you do various kinds of crimes, if you deal drugs, we will punish you. But simply advocating legalization of drugs or dealing drugs or sharply condemning the existing political order or particular religions or whatever else, no, we can't punish you there. We can punish the conduct. We can't punish the speech. Of course, we can speak out against that. We can argue, no, everybody should be more tolerant. Everybody should be more peaceful. That is also something that the government can do. But it can't try to suppress ideas for fear, even justifiable fear, that those ideas will lead people to act badly. The essence of free speech and the essence of democracy is people need to be able to debate all these questions. And one example is transgender rights, right? There's a hot debate right now about how society should deal with people who are transgender. Should there be anti-discrimination rules prohibiting discrimination based on gender identity? The Supreme Court recently said existing rules already cover that, but maybe should they be broadened? Should it be narrowed? Should transgender athletes be allowed to compete on women's sports teams? There's a hot debate about this. The surveys that I've seen suggest the public is about 2-1 against allowing transgender athletes to compete women's sports teams. But of course, and again, in a democracy, we need to have a debate about that. Or should transgender people have access to what was generally seen as women-only spaces, like women's dressing rooms, let's say, or sororities, living in sororities, or what have you? There's a controversy about that right now in Wyoming, the university there. In a free country, we debate those things without being threatened with jail for just debating those. And of course, free speech has been the engine of huge levels of protection, or excuse me, huge improvements with regard to racism, rights of sexual minorities, and so on and so forth. Civil rights movement was done through free speech, and the court often stepped in to protect that. Women's rights movement has succeeded through free speech. Movement towards greater religious tolerance has benefited from free speech. Movement towards greater rights for sexual minorities like gays, lesbians, transgender people, that too has been through free speech, but there also can be responses, can be arguments against those arguments that are also protected by free speech.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree for sure that it's kind of the emotion behind this, especially with liberals, is that they don't see how far we've gotten to with free speech and debates, and has helped the entire country. But the motion behind it is we need to be perfect, and like this law is potentially saying we need to stop these before they murder people. Right? We need to find the people that potentially will murder those people and stop them before they can get to that. Which is, essentially impossible to predict. But if you can think back to there are movies that are made that are about this, and you can think if writers can imagine a storyline to create a movie behind it, then lawmakers could also imagine this idea and this emotion to feel what the state is feeling behind a murder and try to stop it before it even would happen. And I think that's kind of where it comes from. The motivation is that emotion place.
I entirely agree that there should be attempts to stop crimes before they happen. The threat of punishing criminals is most effective precisely when it prevents the crime, not just when it punishes the crime, right? We say, look, if you commit this crime, we're going to fine you, or we're going to throw you in prison, or we're going to execute you. Not because we want to punish you. Sometimes it's part of that, but chiefly because we don't want you to do the thing that we feel the need to punish. That's perfectly sensible. And there are other kinds of laws like bans on conspiracy to commit crimes, bans on attempt to commit crimes that likewise aim to prevent the harm from taking place. In principle, I think that's fine. It's just the First Amendment says you can't restrict the freedom of speech, even as a means of preventing crime. And again, the reason is we can't really trust whoever happens to be in power to make those kinds of decisions. You might think, well, it would be this New York law is lovely. We need to have the New York legislature have more power to do
Right.
good things, even if they restrict speech. But would you say the same thing about the Trump administration or a future Trump administration or DeSantis administration? Conversely, you might say, yeah, we like what DeSantis has been doing in some respects to restrict free speech because we trust him. Okay, well, would you trust Kamala Harris to do the same thing? And the general answer that the court has given is we don't trust anybody who's in power, the left or right or center, with the power to prevent crime through the means of suppressing advocacy of particular views.
Right. And that's probably a better way to say what I was trying to say earlier about Elon and Twitter. I wasn't trying to say a public company cannot create that policy necessarily, but I'm saying, like you said, who can you actually trust? Really, you shouldn't have to trust anybody to make those decisions, because it can go back and forth with, like what you said. If you trust somebody on the right, then you obviously probably would not trust somebody on the left. And when they get into that position, they're going to block what you say instead of what you used to be able to say potentially. And that's the example I was trying to use with Elon versus the public company that Twitter used to be.
Well, so Twitter used to be a public company in the sense it was that it sold its stock to the public. It was still a privately owned company. It
Right,
was still
right.
not bound by the First Amendment. It wasn't bound
Not
by the
federally
First Amendment.
regulated. Right. Yeah.
Before Elon Musk bought it and wasn't bound by the First Amendment. It isn't bound by it now that he's bought it. It's the government that's bound by the First Amendment.
Right.
Although, again, you could certainly imagine, and in fact, the Florida and Texas legislatures have done more than imagine. You can imagine laws that impose special statutory obligations on various platforms to, for example, be viewpoint neutral in their moderation policies and such. It's just that those laws themselves have to be viewpoint neutral at the very least.
Okay. And do you think that your lawsuit and the ability to fight this law is hurt by the likes of even private companies like Facebook and YouTube that are already moving these directions, across the entire world, potentially, with their systems?
I don't think that my particular lawsuit is likely to have even some indirect effect on the big social media platforms. First of all, they already have policies that cover the things that New York law does.
Right.
And second, they've got bigger things on their minds. Among other things, they're also subject to all sorts of rules throughout all the countries in which they operate. That one particular kind of unusual, at least for now, unusual statute in New York is being challenged. And even if we succeed in the challenge, I don't think it's going to affect the judgment of Facebook and Twitter about how they're going to do moderation. We do hope that, first, we hope we'll win. Second, we hope that'll set a good precedent for the future. And we hope it'll discourage legislators from trying to coercively act against platforms with regard to particular viewpoints, as New York is doing here. But that's kind of the most that we can expect from this.
And what does winning look like in this case? Are you trying to block the entire language of the law or potentially just change how the language is?
No, the law is quite clearly targeted at a particular viewpoint. It's hard for us to see how how any part of the law could be salvaged, given our First Amendment arguments. So I think what we're hoping is, first of all, the judge will issue a preliminary injunction, which means it's going to be blocked pending further proceedings. Then New York could, for example, immediately appeal and ask the Second Circuit, which is the federal appellate court that's in charge of several states, including New York, to rehear the case. And we hope the Second Circuit will see it our way. And then, of course, New York could ask the U.S. Supreme Court to consider the matter. But the U.S. Supreme Court hears literally 1% of the cases that it's asked to hear. and when I say literally, I mean literally in the sense of literally, not literally in the sense of figuratively. It really is 1%. And
Right.
even when a state asks that the court review a decision blocking a state law, court's general view is, look, unless there's some disagreement among lower courts, you're entitled to 2 days in court. You're entitled to the day in trial court and day in appellate court. You're not entitled to a third day before us, the U.S. Supreme Court. So I doubt this case is going to go, whether we lose below or win below, to the U.S. Supreme Court. But it very well might go to the appellate court, which is good because appellate courts set binding precedent, at least for the states within their jurisdiction, and powerful persuasive precedent for the rest of the country. Whereas a district court decision, a federal trial court decision, will set something of a persuasive precedent, but less effective. So we're hoping it's going to end up before the appellate court, whether because we lose, then we certainly will appeal, or because the state loses and then the state appeals. Although it's also possible that the state might lose and say, oh, we read the judge's opinion. We don't think there's going to be any different result if we go up to the Court of Appeals. So why don't we go back to the legislature and see if they want to revise things in some way? Let them figure it out. Hard to tell.
Understood. So on your blog, the Volokh conspiracy, I was going to ask, and I did take a peek, just I was curious, like how many comments do you get, and how many do you think you would have to block potentially if the law came in and you have to put in your policy?
Well, as to how many we get, it depends on the comment. When we have our open threads, every Thursday we have an open thread. Anybody can post anything they want. We get many hundreds. For example, yesterday we had 727 comments on the Thursday open thread. For other posts, some of them draw no comments at all, even posts that I think are really good and substantive. Some of them are so technical that a lot of readers either have no interest in them, maybe, or at least feel they have nothing to say. Others draw. It's quite common to have posts with dozens of comments, occasionally with hundreds of comments. Now, as to how many we will have to block, the answer is 0. As I mentioned, the law, we think it's invalid, but at least to the legislature's credit, they don't require us to block comments. They require us to have a policy, and as we read the law, they require us to respond to the comments. To respond to complaints, but we don't have to block any comments. Now, how many complaints will we get? It's very hard to tell. We get occasional complaints here and there, but that's in part precisely because we don't have a policy that's focused on supposed hateful conduct or hate speech, and because we kind of are known for not moderating much at all. It may very well be that if the law is upheld, then in that case, and then we'll put up the policy. People say, oh, they've got a policy. We should take advantage of that.
Right.
So it could be, we could get a bunch of those. Our point is our First Amendment rights are violated. My First Amendment rights are violated, whether I have to respond to a lot of complaints or only a few. Because either way, I'm being compelled to put up a policy. Either way, I'm being compelled to respond. Again, if we're reading the statute correctly.
Yeah. And again, I'm curious, if the law were upheld, where do you see this kind of slippery slope leading to other potential laws?
Right. Well, as you pointed out, the rationale for the law is the judgment that the spread of certain ideas online can lead to crime, can persuade people to commit crimes. Again, not a ridiculous rationale. It's certainly possible, whether it's racist or anti-Semitic or anti-gay or anti-trans or anti-police or pro-jihadist or whatever else. So it's hard to imagine them stopping a law that acknowledges is pretty feeble, pretty weak in its compulsions. It's still sufficiently compulsory that it's unconstitutional, but it's relatively weak in its compulsion. I'm expecting that they're going to at some point try to make good on the title, which again says hateful conduct prohibited. I think they're going to try to do what they can to try to prohibit the expression of certain views. And we'd like to nip that in the bud. If we get a decision that says even requiring people to have such policies, even if you give them lots of latitude about what the policies can be, is itself unconstitutional, maybe that'll be a reminder to state legislatures that and to other courts that there is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. There is no exception for any kinds of viewpoints like that.
Because if you can compel what you can't talk about, certainly then you can compel other speech that you have to say, right?
Well, in this case, they are trying to compel other speech. The problem isn't that they're restricting our speech as such. The problem is that they're compelling us to speak. They're compelling us to put up a policy, and as I read it, they're compelling us to respond to reader complaints.
Right. And potentially then you could have to block certain words, certain ideologies within your blog altogether, within the comments, and then you'd have to have a full-time person to moderate all the comments. I would say probably.
Right. If indeed they follow this up with another law that actually does require us to
Right.
block certain comments, yeah, that will be expensive for us, but also beyond just the cost of moderating, it will require us to block views that may very well be fully constitutionally protected, that we don't want to have to block, and we think we have a constitutional right not to block.
Yeah. Before we go, I'm curious about your background and kind of what led you into the free speech and things like this. When you were growing up, what got you into wanting to be a lawyer and do these kind of things and talk about these things?
Well, so my first career was as a computer programmer. I was a computer programmer for 12 years. It was fun. I enjoyed it. But I suppose I wanted to kind of lead a semi-public life. I wanted to comment on new laws, wanted to file briefs in courts. I wanted to appear on talk shows. I wanted to testify before subcommittees. I think it's what many people in a democracy especially want is to play a role in the public life of their nation. Not something like being an elected official or something like that, which would be tremendously temperamentally unsuited to, but to play something of a role in that. And in America, rightly or wrongly, the people who do that are mostly lawyers. So I went to law school, and here I am now. I got pretty much what I wanted, not quite.
There you go. And so you have the blog, and that's hosted on. It's not a website with Volokh blog, right? It's hosted on a different website. Is that correct?
Well, it is. You can call it the Volokh blog. It's Volokh Conspiracy. It's our blog.
The Volokh
We
Conspiracy.
used to be
Yep.
just at volokh.com because we just hosted it ourselves. Then for almost 4 years, we were at the Washington Post. They hosted us. And now we're at Reason Magazine. So you can go and see us at reason.com/Volokh. But it's the same blog, and we have the same editorial independence. We've kind of teamed up with Reason for them to host us and then provide important technical help and other infrastructure, which we're very grateful to them for that. But we're the ones who decide what to post. So it's our blog.
Right. And I'm trying to just tell our audience where to connect to you. So it's the reason. Is it reason.com? Is that correct?
Reason.com/Volokh.
Yep.
Volokh.
And I know you're on Twitter with the Volokh Conspiracy.
Is at Volokh C for Volokh Conspiracy.
Mhm.
Either still or at least back when we started it, you couldn't fit in the whole Volokh Conspiracy, so we called it Volokh C.
And where else should we watch for you, or what else do you have going on? What other talk shows do you get to pop up?
We're on Mastodon because, we like to be hot and hip and happening. We are on Facebook, which is, of course, the opposite of hot and hip and happening, but we have many more readers on Facebook than we do on Mastodon. If you want to, you can go to reason.com/Volokh and subscribe to get our daily posts every night in a newsletter. So we want people to read us however is most convenient to them. And there are lots of ways of doing it. And we're free. By the way, one reason we left the Washington Post is because they were hiking up the paywall, which when we were first there was very easy to avoid, then became much harder to avoid. And we realized we're not in it for the money. We make a little bit of money. By the way, that's what leads the law to apply to us. It only applies to for-profits, which we are. But it's very little. We're in it for the eyeballs. We want people to read what we have to write. We like to think that it's worth reading.
And the Washington Post, curious, did they ever lean toward any kind of moderation or saying what you could say or could not say?
Yes, so the one reason that we left the Washington Post was the paywall. The other reason, and really there were only those two. The other reason was that they started saying that we have to expurgate vulgarities in
Hmm.
our posts. So if I would want to talk, there's a famous case, Cohen v. California, 1971, from the U.S. Supreme Court, said that Cohen was entitled to wear a jacket that said "fuck the draft." So they said, well, no, you got to say F star star star. So we're academics. Our job is to report on things as they are. And for the first 4 years of us working with them, we'd reached an arrangement where we were quoting things accurately, and they
Hmm.
weren't stopping us. But then they said, no, no, these are our editorial standards, and of course, being a private company, they're entitled to have those standards, but they weren't our editorial standards. And for us, the one most important thing is editorial independence. We want to be able to say things, call them as we see them, and describe them accurately without somebody stepping in and saying, no, no, you've got to edit out this or edit in that.
Right. It's kind of where it started with radio and television, moderating those words.
Well,
So
I'm
it
not
wasn't
sure
about
that
just
that's where
changing
it
the
started.
channel.
My sense is that before radio and television were even invented, newspapers had their own internal policies prohibiting certain kinds of vulgarities and other things. And again, they're entitled to do that. And if they think, our audience really doesn't want to see that, we don't want to, we want to position ourselves as the kind of genteel publication that doesn't include that, they have a First Amendment right to do that. I don't approve of the government mandating that, and I agree that for radio and television, the Supreme Court had, by a 5-4 vote, upheld certain kinds of these of restrictions on 7 dirty words on radio and television broadcasting. But newspapers for a long time had that policy. We just weren't willing to go along with it, and when they insisted on it, we decided, it's more important for us to be editorially independent. And thankfully, Reason both isn't interested in putting up any paywalls and isn't interested in telling us what words we can and cannot quote. So we've got a great arrangement with Reason. Very pleased with
That's great. There's definitely bad things about the internet, but a lot of good things about the internet and independent solutions like that. So that's
it.
great to hear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, Eugene Volokh, we appreciate your time. We'll update our audience probably because the Monday the 19th is going to happen before this episode comes out. So we'll try to update what happened there
Mm-hmm.
with the case there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we wish you good luck on that and with everybody that you're helping with. So thank you very much for joining us.
Very much my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll see everyone later. Thanks for joining us.
All the best.